Take on the South is back with its mini-series, Southern Seance, in which we ask famous deceased Southerners through OpenAI ChatGPT, the free version, about their thoughts on the South. But to test just how reliable AI and ChatGPT is, we need human expertise. And so for every famous deceased Southerner we interview on Southern Seance, we have a real-life human expert who would judge AI's efforts. So it's a matter of AI stay in your lane or hang on, AI is doing something useful or interesting, or both. We've done Elvis. Today we turn our attention to Lyndon B. Johnson, our former president. Our living expert to critique and evaluate AI's handling of LBJ as Southerner is Professor Ken Germany of our own USC History Department. Ken Germany knows a great deal about LBJ and Southern politics. Before coming to USC, for example, he was at the University of Virginia's Miller Center for Public Affairs, where he led the LBJ Project and did a variety of other things, including serving as a host for The Record, a nationally distributed PBS interview program on politics and history. Ken, welcome to Take on the South.
Thank you, Mark. It's great to be here.
Okay, so how about we just do it like we did with Elvis, right?
Okay.
I'll read the script.
Which is what you do. You just do it like you did with Elvis.
I just do it like, because they're so similar. I'll read the prompt, and then I'll read my bit, and you can be LBJ.
Okay.
All right, and then you can just tell us what's good and what's awful about this, if anything. So the script that I had is very much, we kept it like we did for Elvis, and I asked ChatGPT to script an interview with Mark Smith, host of Take on the South, and President Lyndon B. Johnson, detailing how and why Johnson understood himself as Southern, how his upbringing in the South influenced his politics, music, food, tastes, religion, and examining how he thought of his music as Southern, which of course was a little bit of a misdirection because I emphasized music too much, but that might have led to something interesting. So the title is Southern Roots, a Conversation with President Lyndon B. Johnson, and that was provided to us by ChatGPT. So it introduces, I'm the host, welcome to Take on the South, the podcast that delves deep into the heart of the South. I'm your host, Mark Smith, and today we have a very special guest, former President Lyndon B. Johnson. We'll be discussing how and why President Johnson understood himself as a Southerner, how his upbringing in the South influenced his politics, music, food tastes, and religion, and we'll also explore how he thought of his music as distinctly Southern. So we transition, and I introduce the President. President Johnson, thank you for joining us today. Let's start with your deep connection to the South. You were born and raised in Stonewall, Texas. How did your Southern upbringing shape your identity and your understanding of yourself as a Southerner?
Well, Mark, I'm glad to be here. My roots in the South run deep. Growing up in the hill country of Texas, I was exposed to the unique culture, history, and values of the South. My family's history was intertwined with the land, and I felt a profound connection to it. The South instilled in me a sense of pride, resilience, and a strong work ethic.
Many people know you for your leadership in civil rights, but how did your Southern heritage influence your political decisions and policies?
My Southern background gave me a unique perspective. I witnessed the injustices and inequalities of segregation and racial discrimination firsthand. I knew that change was necessary, not just for the nation as a whole, but for the South as well. My experiences growing up in the South and understanding its complexities informed my commitment to advancing civil rights.
President Johnson, the South is known for its rich culture. How did your Southern upbringing influence your taste in music, food, and your religious beliefs?
Music was an essential part of Southern life. I grew up listening to gospel, country, and blues. These genres reflected the struggles and joys of Southern people. They shaped my musical tastes, and you could often find me playing some tunes on my harmonica. As for food, I loved Southern comfort food. Barbecue, fried chicken, cornbread, and sweet tea were staples in our household. They represented the warmth and hospitality of the South. Religion also played a significant role in my life. The Southern Baptist faith was deeply ingrained in our community. It provided a moral compass that guided me throughout my life.
You mentioned your love for music, and you were known for playing the harmonica. How did you view music as a distinctly Southern expression?
Music in the South is a form of storytelling. It's a way to convey emotions, experiences, and the essence of the region, whether it's the blues lamenting hard times or gospel songs celebrating faith. Music is an integral part of the Southern identity. When I played the harmonica, I aimed to capture the spirit of the South and share its stories with others. It was a way to connect with people on a deeper level.
President Johnson, your insights into Southern roots and how they influenced your life and political career have been truly enlightening. Thank you for joining us today on Take on the South.
Thank you, Mark. It's been a pleasure to discuss my Southern heritage and the impact it had on my life and my vision for a more just and equitable South.
All right, I'm not going to read the closing that it gave us. It's basically puffing us up to listen again. I'd rather get into the nuts and bolts of what ChatGPT spat out, and I'll be up front. I did emphasize the music stuff because the first version I got back didn't really talk about it, so I emphasized it twice,
Okay.
which probably skewed this a bit. But anyway, Ken, you're the expert. How would you grade this, right?
I would say that ChatGPT is the worst speechwriter in history. And you know, we're talking about LBJ, who for 3 decades of his life spoke the words other people wrote for him. Mm-hmm. He was in a process, right? So, you know, that's normal, right? So, you know, he was a professional politician. I would like to have seen AI walk into LBJ's office to interview for being his speechwriter and produce this and see how fast it would take him to show him to the door.
So it's got none of the cadence, none of the voice of the president.
No,
right?
the LBJ library has an animatronic LBJ.
Okay.
And you can go and hear him. And I would presume that that is far closer to the actual LBJ than AI could get with what we've got here.
Gotcha.
Yeah, there's almost no LBJ
right.
in here.
So there's no kind of emotional texture, no feel, no cadence with, you know, the words, right?
Yeah, and LBJ is not going to, unless he was talking to a Southerner, he's not going to call himself a Southerner. That's number one.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, of course. Right. Okay. In terms of the content, though, Ken, is it just like the Elvis example? It gets bland things right. Does it get anything wrong?
It gets some bland things right. Well, and I do want to get to the wrong thing, which is really funny. Johnson, in the production of his memoirs, had a team of people that wrote his memoirs. And so he would read drafts of it. And the story that the person that became the director of the LBJ library would tell, and the people would tell, is that they would bring a draft to LBJ and it would have his personality in the draft. Okay. And he would hate it. And he would scratch it out and said, I don't want that in there. He wanted a more statesmanlike. And so in some ways, LBJ was his own AI. Oh. And he liked to bland himself down. He didn't like that, Texas Hill Country texture to come out. And if you listen to his speeches and then compare them to his secret recordings from the White House, there really are 2 different LBJs.
So this is really interesting. Now, are we actually willing to say that that's a clever aspect of AI, that AI understood this and then repeated?
It may have, yes. It's a very bland, inarticulate, not inarticulate. I don't know that Johnson used lists. I almost read out the comma in all of these because it seems so odd for Johnson to have just a list of stuff. That was not his speaking style.
Very interesting. So this surface level kind of blandness actually has an authenticity to it, right?
I think so. And if you think about LBJ in the era in which he came of age, so 1930s with the New Deal, there's radio, there's no TV. Mm-hmm. Most of his political career is not a TV-centered thing.
Right.
It's a print world. Mm-hmm. Even if it's radio, it's still print. And so being good with your elocution, hitting all of the syllables just right, pronouncing the G's at the end of your sentence, because things were going to be written down.
Yeah.
And so people got their information from a politician, basically what they read in the newspaper, up until you get into that late 1950s period. And so I think he's still attached to that written world. And so I think when he was doing an official thing, he stuck to the script.
Right.
And there were a few times where he does go off the script, or at least is reportedly to go off the script. One was in New Orleans during the 64 campaign, and used the word Negro, Negro, Negro to talk about how Southern politicians would use the race card. White Southern politicians would use the race card.
Yeah.
And so he let his personality come out in that. And so that's written about a lot. But mostly he tries to contain all of that spinning Johnson.
So highly
that's inside.
edited Johnson. He'd probably not have sat down for this interview, is what you're saying.
He probably might have. Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to know. Yeah.
But he would want it very controlled. Right?
He would have taken charge of this interview and may not have given you a chance to talk.
Okay. It's probably a better interview then. All right. So AI is it peppers the answers with a few facts that lend it a sort of authenticity. Like, I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Right? What are the facts that are right?
So Stonewall, Texas is basically in the era. The Baptist community, so Baptist faith was ingrained in our community. His mother was Baptist, her family was Baptist. Johnson himself was in the Christian church, or the Disciples of Christ. Okay. Johnson loved going to church. In 64, after, when he's president, he goes to church almost every Sunday. He doesn't like to miss church. He loves going to small churches. When he went back to Texas, he loved to go to this little stone church nearby where it was. So I think he connected himself to a much larger thing. So I think in general that faith and community that comes out of faith is important to Johnson. Southern comfort food, barbecue for sure. So, one of the first things he does as president in 63 is bring the Chancellor of West Germany down to the ranch and has a big, huge beef rib barbecue there for the Chancellor, and, structures everything around barbecue. So he definitely, Texas loves barbecue.
Okay.
And beef barbecue, right?
Interesting.
That's the key thing there. Fried chicken, cornbread, sweet tea. Yeah, I guess so. There's a great conversation with the woman that ran the food part of Johnson's life, and she talks about how much he loved beans. Like green beans, like he had this green bean thing, and she didn't know why. He just loved beans, right?
But that doesn't appear here.
It doesn't appear here. He loved peanut brittle. There's like a particular peanut brittle that he liked. He was on the leading edge of diet sodas.
Was he really?
So like Fresca, so if you know that,
Yeah.
grapefruit kind of flavory.
Was it
no sugar?
They had it back then.
Had it back then.
I had no idea. I thought it was new.
He was supposed to go on a series of diets. So he had a heart attack in his 40s.
Right.
And so he adjusted his smoking. He adjusted his alcohol intake. Yeah. He started going for walks and things. But he's still, he gains a lot of weight and then he loses a lot of weight. And so his diet is definitely a part of his consciousness.
Interesting.
But the music part here really did throw me. The harmonica, right? I mean, we probably should just dedicate the whole show to
let's talk
how
about
AI. I don't know where they get this harmonica thing from. So I've been listening to LBJ in a very particular, exhaustive way for 25 years.
Right.
And there are probably people alive that didn't know Johnson that have listened to him more than me, but they're not many, right? We're a very small group. And I've never heard him or anyone talk about him playing a musical instrument. I did. So you sent me this yesterday. And so I said, okay, I'm going to look at the oral histories from the LBJ library. His friend that succeeded him in his congressional seat, Jake Pickle, played the harmonica. And so there's some oral histories about Jake Pickle playing the harmonica, but Johnson playing the harmonica. Now, if you said what sort of instrument, Johnson played people, right? So he could play people like a fiddle, but I don't think Johnson could play the fiddle. So for the YouTube, I brought a picture from my office, and this is Johnson singing with his dog. And this was a dog they found, his daughter found at a gas station in Texas. And Johnson basically adopted it. And there are these great pictures of him swimming with this dog, and the dog is sitting in his lap in the pool at the LBJ ranch. And he taught this dog to howl with him or to sing with him. So he's in this picture here. So if you're not looking at the YouTube one, this is in the Oval Office, and the U.S. ambassador to Great Britain is having a drink next to Johnson, and Johnson's holding this little white dog in his lap, and they both have their heads cocked back, howling. And so this is one of the classic images of Johnson.
This is quite well known. Right?
This is well known, and so this is Johnson singing, right? And this would be he probably sang hymns in church, but I don't know where the harmonica comes from. My guess would be that the machines saw Johnson and Southern music and maybe put Robert Johnson, the Crossroads, the sell your soul to the devil to become a great musician kind of thing. And so maybe just blending in that blues tradition and using the harmonica.
Okay, I think I don't know where it's getting it from, obviously. I think it's a very generous interpretation for AI, what you just said, because I think what it's doing is marrying Lyndon Johnson and things Southern. So, for example, the food, I think it lucks out on barbecue. I just think it's like, yeah, okay, I'm going to list stuff that's Southern food, fried chicken, cornbread, sweet tea. Well, of course, they're Southern food. And I'll add in barbecue, but I don't think it knows the association. The harmonica thing, I think, is the same thing. I think it's Southern music, harmonica. It could have been a fiddle, but it should have picked up on this, right? It should have picked up on his voice, music, singing in church, and it didn't.
There's so much it didn't pick up.
Okay,
and that's really shocking. Yeah. So it gets wrong. I think it gets wrong. I'm a historian, so I'm quite willing to say I got that wrong. Right? I've done that my whole career. It's like, I messed up on that one. Sorry about that. But we try not to, right? We try to get things as best that we can. Yeah. But I think it gets the harmonica part so wrong that it's really laughable. But the parts that people associate, I think just like a basic Google search of Johnson and a few words would come up with a much different thing than the AI thing here, right? So if I just use my example of going to dinner parties or meeting new people or sitting down with somebody somewhere and they say, oh, you do LBJ. First of all, if they know who LBJ is. Mm-hmm. Okay. And if you're talking about college students, you have to explain that very carefully because he really has disappeared. They know something about John Kennedy, but LBJ, we're at the point now, 60 years later, that you have to explain who this person was. He was these stories about his body functions, right? That's what you're going to get.
That's right.
Him inviting people into the bathroom while he's going number 2 and, trying to test out their manhood by seeing whether they would just talk to him like it was no big deal. Right. He liked to talk about bull parts and cutting things off of animals. And he liked to talk about cutting things off of men and people holding those things in their desk drawers, right? So he uses these, sexual masculinity kinds of things. So that was so his sense of humor, his way of talking, basically is a middle school boy who was born and raised in a barnyard, right? Okay. Which means he's really funny. Yeah. He's still, for the context of it, he was incredibly funny at the time, and he says some really funny stuff, and that's definitely not something AI picks up. Right. LBJ here is not funny at all. He's very much a robot.
So it lighted on LBJ and civil rights for obvious reasons, and I get that. But it missed out a bunch of other stuff, right?
There's no war and poverty here. There's no Great Society.
No, there's no Vietnam.
And part of the Great Society is because that word drops off the table in American culture, unless it's used as a criticism of Democrats. Right? Yeah. So that basically, you can trace that word, you can trace poverty and its use, and it just falls off the table toward the end of Johnson's, and nobody talks about those two things in a positive way after that. Yeah. And Vietnam has a similar thing, the way that it gets talked about in American culture. So it may not have appeared, those words might not have appeared in places where the machines could pick it up really easily. The combinations of words that are characters, I guess, that AI is recognizing and putting together for this instant essay, they're too complex.
Yeah, and also, so much depends on the question, right? So if I'd have put in war, then it'll probably spat something back, right?
Yeah.
In response to what you're doing, I did emphasize music just because I was kind of curious to see what it did. The first version did not mention the harmonica.
Okay.
All right. But if I mention music twice, it's struggling to find something and to give me something back. I was struck by this phrase on Southern identity at the very beginning. He says, "My roots in the South run deep. Growing up in the hill country of Texas, I was exposed to the unique culture, history, and values of the South." Okay, very bland. But then he says, "My family's history was intertwined with the land, and I felt a profound connection to it." Is that, Ken? Is that just one of those kind of stereotypes? The South, people are connected to the land. Is there some basis to that?
Well, first of all, I circled the word intertwined. That's a lot of syllables for Johnson to use in his I mean, he's very direct. I mean, he's an action verb kind of speaker, right. And to use. I'm going to go back and search for the word intertwined to see if he ever uses that word. So that does not strike me at all as something. But the connection with the land, I think, is very clear. He loved the ranch. He went on a systematic process of buying up properties around the ranch that he bought from family members to create the proper Southern. And it really, and part of it is like Johnson. I don't know that Johnson really thought of himself as Southern, more as Texan. Yeah. Like, so if you think about Texas, folks from Texas often might think of themselves as Texan first, and Southern second, or Western second. And so Johnson threads this little fence line between the South and the West, and is part of this everything is bigger than Texas, and Texas is its own special place. It's got its own special history. And so if you changed this to Texas and took the South out, I think you would get a different answer. But he loved the Pedernales River. His ranch was right there. The Texas White House was right there. He connected this amazing communications system to this rural Texas place so that he could be in conversation, built an enormous airstrip that could land at least a small jet. Air Force One couldn't land there. And so he wanted to connect the place, that land that he loved, to his job. And so he spent an enormous amount of time in Texas. He liked being able to fly directly to the ranch. And so it's there's some great pictures of him and Lady Bird lying down in a field of wildflowers. And so if you know, Lady Bird has the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center in Texas, which is a big deal now. And so they both loved the land. They both loved particularly the hill country. And it was an essential part of who he was. And there were these lakes and rivers around there, and he had these big fast boats, and he liked to go out on the lake. He liked to have a good time. So Texas, and particularly Texas Hill Country, is central to him, and his family's story is central to him as well. There's not much tension here about his growing up, but his parents, were clearly people that shaped him, and you can see parts of their personality coming out in his later personality.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, because fundamentally this is a very flat, kind of non-temporal portrayal of a person. There's no sense of change over time. There's no sense of staging in life. I'm just LBJ, and this is how I've always been, right? I mean, it's one of the limitations of this technology. It's not going to give you that sense of historic growth, yeah?
Yeah, and I'm trying to think of historic growth and what you would include. I'm trying to think of if I were AI and somebody dropped in and said, "Kent, answer this question. Write me a script about his upbringing in the South and politics and food." I think what I would start with is the humiliations that he experienced in life as part of growing up. And I think the civil rights stuff that comes through here is an essential part of Johnson. Now, this is where you probably get a lot of disagreement about people who knew Johnson or people that study. I think Johnson's incredibly empathetic. He's incredibly self-centered, and he's a big baby, right? I mean, that's my psychological analysis of Johnson. He's just a big baby. Sure. And you have to recognize that. People had to recognize that in dealing with him. But it's him seeing people suffering. It's him seeing people that worked for him at his house, they were African American, that had to travel to D.C. to work for him in D.C. and not have a place to stay along the way. And so he has this phrase where, she had to squat in the road to pee, right? And so he has this famous moment where he's in his early life as a school teacher in Cotulla, Texas, and the experience of seeing the discrimination and the role of segregation against Mexican American or Tejano students that he taught is going to be one of those searing things that really sticks in his mind. And then there's this instance when he's a kid and they played a practical joke on him and he sat in this hot mustard and it burned his bottom and he cried about it and the boys made fun of him. And so he talks about that later on. So there are these moments where he doesn't like to see people suffer. And for Lyndon Johnson, his own personal concerns become national policy. And so that's where I think AI does pick up some bits and pieces in here. And I think mostly the positive stuff that's written about Johnson is linked to civil rights. It is linked to that humanity part of him. Right. And the part we don't get is the baby killer Johnson. Right. Hey, LBJ, how many kids have you killed today? And so we don't get that part. We don't get the really difficult, all the parts of being president are really difficult. Right. Trying to be a Cold War president in the 1960s and figuring out what to do. That is not at all here. But the question didn't ask about the Cold War. If you ask about the Cold War, you probably would get more of that hostility toward Johnson.
You're right, and the question is sort of deliberately anodyne, right? It's like, well, you give me your interpretation. It's kind of opening it up. Conceivably, AI could have selected Vietnam as opposed to the civil rights, or in addition to the civil rights, right? It could have done that. But perhaps it didn't because it doesn't associate Vietnam as a Southern issue, but it does civil rights.
Yeah, and maybe if just the word South and didn't have Southern in the question. So right. So upbringing in the South, take on the South podcast. So it does interpret South as being
not South
U.S.
Vietnam. It's the US South.
So AI is making some assumptions here that we're talking about the United States and not South Korea or South Vietnam or your theory about we were talking before about South America and how it could switch America and South around for coming up with different answers.
It's getting it. It's filling in the gaps, right? It's filling in the silences. Ken, you know so much about this. I'm sure we could talk for ages about it. But is there any other sort of takeaway you'd like listeners to think about from this odd and interesting exercise?
Lyndon Johnson is incredibly fascinating. He is incredibly frustrating as a historical figure to study. And one of the great things that we have is that he was president in the 1960s when recording equipment was cheap and it didn't require a whole lot of expertise to operate it. And so for the YouTube camera, there are close to 500 and something to 600 hours recorded on these things. And so this was a dictabelt that fit on a cylinder. These were from the LBJ library that they gave. These were extras. Fits on a cylinder. They're 15 minutes long, and Johnson recorded his telephone conversations on these. And so what I think would be interesting is if you had AI take the Johnson recordings, and I suspect AI will improve and improve and improve, and when, whatever tentacles spread out there, I suspect we'll get a much different version of Johnson. But one thing that so far AI is not going to be able to do is actually be Lyndon Johnson.
Right.
And so what I've done for 25 years is listen to dead people. And there's still a few people alive that are on those recordings, but you get a Johnson here that really gives us an insight into the workings of a brilliant political mind who was deeply flawed. And so I definitely would encourage people to take a look at things, and I'll plug something here. So I'm an editor involved with the LBJ recordings, and I was involved in a project with the LBJ library, and you can go to lbjrecordings.com or .org, and there are a whole series of 100 or so little snippets of Johnson recordings that the editors that have been listening to Johnson for a long, long time have put together. They're scrolling so you can follow along and see the words as Johnson is saying them. And it covers things from his own personality and his politics. There's Vietnam, there's civil rights, there's war and poverty. And so you can go and just sample those and get a bit of flavor of Lyndon Johnson. And of course, the one that everybody should listen to first off is him ordering pants. Jack Valenti, who's probably best known to Americans as the white-haired guy that would come out at the Academy Awards because he was ran the Motion Picture Association of America. But he was one of his key figures that was with him all the time as president. And I was able to be at an event where he was, and he said that conversation about pants is as close as it gets to Lyndon, right? That's to him, like that's Lyndon unvarnished, and that's the Lyndon that I knew. And so if you do listen to it, you might want to put in headphones. And if you're going to teach it in a public school or something like that, you probably want to listen to it ahead of time because he uses words like bunghole and other things to describe it. But he's explaining the value of a well-tailored pant. And to do that, he calls the person that runs the Hager Pants Company to do it. And so they have this extended conversation about how Johnson liked his pants to fit. And it is a great conversation because it shows you how much he needed to be in control of information. And you can see him almost writing a memo about his pants as they go through this conversation. And at the end of it, he sums it up basically like he had done for the past 30 years to somebody that he was working with to make sure they got the instructions right. And so it is a funny conversation. You do have a Texas guy using his barnyard language to explain how he liked things to another man. And so I would encourage that. The thing I'll end with is Bill Moyers, who's probably best known to most Americans as that guy on PBS or that guy on ABC. Yep. He was a young Baptist minister, journalist that worked for Johnson. He flies into the ranch on the day of the assassination. Right? So, I mean, this is a guy that's intimately involved in the Johnson administration from the beginning and knew Johnson politically and in those years maybe as well as anyone. And he said that Lyndon Johnson was the 13 most interesting people he'd ever met. Right? And so a part of it is like which Johnson you're talking about. So we now have the AI Johnson. Right. That is a snapshot from October 2023. That is just a snapshot and probably will disappear, but maybe this is number 14.
Yeah, sure. Very interesting. Kent Germany, thank you for being on Take on the South. And more importantly, thank you for reminding us that professors are much more interesting than AI.
Maybe.
Maybe.
Let's ask our students that question. Wait, don't ask our students that question.
Thanks so much. It was great. We enjoyed it.